The winter of 1945. Snow covers the ruins of what was once the mighty Third Reich. But this isn't just the story of military defeat. This is about what happens when the cycle of violence reaches its breaking point, when victims become perpetrators, and revenge becomes a force more destructive than any weapon of war. For 4 years, the Eastern Front had been a theater of unprecedented brutality. The Nazis didn't just invade the Soviet Union, they declared war on an entire civilization. What they unleashed would eventually come back to haunt them in ways they never imagined. This is the story of Operation Bagration in June 1944, when the Red Army began its final push westward. But more than that, it's about what happened when Soviet soldiers crossed into German territory for the first time. What they found there, and what they did, remains one of the most difficult chapters in the history of the Second World War. Between January and August 1945, historians estimate that up to 2 million German women became victims of sexual violence at the hands of Soviet forces. It was, by any measure, the largest incident of mass sexual assault in recorded history. Yet for decades, this tragedy remained buried in silence, too painful for survivors to speak about, too complicated for historians to address, and too inconvenient for the victors to acknowledge. Today, we're going to examine not just what happened, but why it happened, and what it teaches us about the true cost of war. To understand 1945, we have to go back to June 22, 1941. A Sunday morning when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. But this wasn't just another military campaign. In Hitler's own words, this was to be a war of annihilation. The Nazi ideology painted this conflict in stark racial terms. To them, Slavs weren't just enemies, they were subhuman. The plan wasn't simply to defeat the Soviet Union militarily, but to destroy it completely. To make room for German settlers in what Hitler called Lebensraum, living space. What followed was systematic brutality on a scale that's hard to comprehend. The Wehrmacht, the SS, and special mobile killing units called Einsatzgruppen didn't just target military forces. They deliberately targeted civilians. Entire villages were wiped out. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were starved, worked to death, or simply executed. Consider Leningrad, a city under siege for 872 days. Over 1 million civilians died, most from starvation. In Ukraine, the Nazis implemented policies designed to starve the population into submission. In Belarus, they burned entire villages with their inhabitants still inside. Soviet war correspondent Vasily Grossman, who followed the Red Army throughout the war, documented what Soviet soldiers found as they liberated their own territory. Burned villages, mass graves, evidence of systematic torture and murder, families destroyed, children orphaned or worse. For the average Soviet soldier pushing westward in 1944, this wasn't ancient history. These were their villages, their families, their children. Many had lost everything, parents, siblings, wives, children, to what they saw as German barbarism. The Soviet propaganda machine, led by writer Ilya Ehrenberg, didn't help matters. His articles were distributed to millions of soldiers, articles with titles like "Kill." He wrote, "If you have killed one German, kill another. There is nothing more amusing for us than German corpses." Now, this doesn't excuse what came next, but it helps explain the mindset of Soviet soldiers as they crossed into German territory in late 1944. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were men consumed by a desire for revenge that had been building for 3.5 years. February 2, 1943, Stalingrad. For the first time in the war, an entire German army was destroyed. Field Marshal Paulus surrendered, and with him, the myth of German invincibility died. But Stalingrad was more than just a military victory. It was the moment when the roles began to reverse. The hunters became the hunted. The invaders became the invaded. Over the next 18 months, the Red Army pushed westward with increasing momentum. They reclaimed Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states. And everywhere they went, they found more evidence of German atrocities. More mass graves, more destroyed communities, more reasons to hate. By October 1944, Soviet forces reached the border of East Prussia, German territory. For the first time since Napoleon, a foreign army was about to invade the German heartland. The German civilian population was terrified. For over a decade, Nazi propaganda had warned them about the Mongolian hordes from the east. They had been told that if the Soviets ever reached German soil, they would rape, murder, and pillage without mercy. Tragically, much of this propaganda would prove to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. The first Soviet units to cross into German territory found something that enraged them even further. While their own homeland lay in ruins, German villages were largely untouched. Clean houses with gardens, well-stocked pantries, comfortable lives that had been built while German armies were destroying everything the Soviet soldiers held dear. A Soviet war correspondent later wrote, "We hated seeing their clean, undamaged houses with roses. I wanted them to suffer like we had suffered." As the Red Army advanced deeper into German territory, reports began to filter back about widespread violence against German civilians. Looting was rampant, property was destroyed, civilians were killed, and worst of all, women were being systematically assaulted. Initially, some Soviet commanders tried to maintain discipline. There were orders against mistreating civilians. But these orders were often ignored, sometimes with the tacit approval of officers who felt the Germans deserved whatever they got. Marshal Rokossovsky, one of the more disciplined Soviet commanders, later admitted that controlling his troops became impossible once they entered German territory. The desire for revenge was simply too strong. What happened next is difficult to describe, but it's important that we understand the scope and nature of what German civilians, particularly women, experienced. The violence was not random. It was systematic, widespread, and brutal. In many towns and cities, it continued for weeks or even months. Soviet war correspondent Natalia Jess later admitted that Soviet troops assaulted females from 8 to 80, describing the army as having become something monstrous. In Berlin alone, hospital records from after the war show between 95,000 and 130,000 cases of sexual assault. Across the eastern regions of Germany, East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, historians estimate that at least 1.4 million women were victimized. But numbers can't capture the human reality. These were mothers, daughters, grandmothers, children. They were hiding in basements and cellars, hoping to avoid the soldiers searching for them with flashlights. They were covering their faces with dirt and dressing in rags, trying to make themselves invisible. Some tried to offer themselves to single soldiers, hoping to avoid gang assaults. Others were betrayed by neighbors desperate to protect their own families. Many were victimized repeatedly. Some reports suggest dozens of times. The violence wasn't limited to adults. Children as young as 8 were victimized. Elderly women in their 80s weren't spared. Even women who were clearly Jewish, who had suffered under Nazi persecution themselves, found no protection. One particularly tragic case illustrates the long-term consequences. Hannelore Kohl was 12 years old in May 1945 when Soviet soldiers attacked her. She suffered injuries that would plague her for the rest of her life. In 2001, 56 years later, she took her own life, still unable to escape the trauma of those few days in 1945. The psychological impact was devastating. Thousands of women took their own lives immediately after the assaults. Some were even forced to do so by their own fathers or husbands, who considered the family's honor more important than their daughters' or wives' lives. Many who survived found themselves pregnant as a result of the assaults. In a Germany devastated by war with limited medical care available, many of these pregnancies ended in dangerous, illegal abortions. Those children who were born faced a lifetime of stigma as Russian children, abandoned, impoverished, and blamed for circumstances entirely beyond their control. When the war ended in May 1945, you might think the violence would have stopped. Didn't. In many areas, it continued for months. Soviet soldiers were supposed to be occupying forces, maintaining order. Instead, many continued to see German women as legitimate targets for their rage. The trauma extended far beyond the immediate victims. Entire communities were devastated. In Berlin, infant mortality rates soared to catastrophic levels. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of newborns didn't survive during the immediate post-war period. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of this tragedy was what happened to the survivors afterward. In both East and West Germany, speaking about what had happened became virtually impossible. In East Germany, criticizing Soviet forces was forbidden. In West Germany, there was pressure to move on, to rebuild, to not dwell on the past. Many survivors found themselves victims twice, first of the original assaults, then of a society that refused to acknowledge their suffering. They were sometimes blamed for allowing themselves to be victimized. They faced suspicion from their own communities. Many were never able to speak about their experiences, carrying their trauma in silence for decades. The perpetrators, meanwhile, largely escaped any consequences. When the war ended, most Soviet soldiers simply went home. There were no war crimes trials for these acts, no acknowledgement from Soviet leadership, no compensation for the victims. For decades, this remained a forbidden topic in historical research. Soviet historians couldn't address it without criticizing the Red Army. German historians struggled with how to discuss German suffering without appearing to minimize Nazi crimes. Western historians often avoided the topic entirely as too sensitive or politically charged. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that serious historical research into these events became possible. Even today, discussing this history remains difficult and controversial. Today, historians estimate that up to 2 million German women were victimized during the Soviet advance into Germany. Thousands, possibly tens of thousands, died as a result, some from injuries, others by suicide. Countless others lived with the trauma for the rest of their lives. This doesn't diminish the horrific crimes committed by Nazi Germany. The Holocaust, the murder of Soviet civilians, the systematic brutality of the Eastern Front. These remain among the darkest chapters in human history. But recognizing German suffering doesn't minimize Nazi crimes. Instead, it reminds us that war creates cycles of violence that often spiral beyond anyone's control. It shows us that even justified wars can produce unjustifiable consequences. As one survivor put it, "We survived the war, but we never truly survived the peace that followed." Understanding this history isn't about assigning blame or keeping score of suffering. It's about recognizing the full human cost of conflict. It's about remembering that behind every statistic is a human being, someone's mother, daughter, sister, wife. And it's about ensuring that we never forget the price of hatred and the responsibility we all share to break the cycles of violence that can turn any of us from victims into perpetrators and back again. Here's what most history classes will never teach you. Here's what your textbooks left out. Here's the conversation that makes people uncomfortable at dinner tables around the world. This story is not ancient history. There are women alive today who lived through this. Their children, now in their 70s, grew up carrying secrets they were never allowed to speak. Their grandchildren inherited trauma they don't even understand. But here's the thing that should terrify you. This could happen again. This is happening again. Right now, in conflicts around the world, the same cycles of revenge and brutalization are playing out. Different countries, different uniforms, same human nature. If this video made you uncomfortable, good. History should make you uncomfortable. Truth should disturb your peace. Because the moment we become comfortable with uncomfortable truths is the moment we stop learning from them. But I need you to do something right now. Don't just watch this and move on to the next video. Don't let this story disappear back into the silence where it's been buried for 80 years. Share this video. Yes, even though it's difficult. Especially because it's difficult. Share it with someone who thinks they know everything about World War II. Share it with someone who believes in simple stories about good guys and bad guys. Share it with someone who needs to understand that history is never as clean as we want it to be. And here's why this matters more than you think. Every time we silence difficult history, we make it easier for it to repeat. Every time we choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, we take one step closer to becoming the people in this story. Your school probably never taught you this. Your history teacher probably skipped this chapter. Your grandparents probably never talked about it. But that silence, That's exactly how forgotten tragedies become repeated tragedies. So hit that subscribe button, not just to support this channel, but because there are dozens of stories like this that have been buried, hidden, or sanitized. Stories that explain why our world is the way it is. Stories that could prevent future horrors if enough people knew about them. Turn on notifications because every video we release pulls back the curtain on another piece of hidden history. Another story that polite society doesn't want you to know. And leave a comment. Tell me what other uncomfortable truths you want uncovered. What other stories have been buried? What other chapters have been torn out of your history books? Because here's what I promise you. The truth doesn't care about your politics. It doesn't care about your nationality. It doesn't care about your comfort level. The truth just is. And the more people who know the truth, the harder it becomes for history to repeat its worst moments. So the question is, are you going to be someone who faces difficult truths? Or someone who hides from them? Are you going to share the story? Or let it disappear back into silence? Are you going to be part of the solution? Or part of the problem? The choice is yours. But choose now. Because every day we wait, every day we stay silent, every day we choose comfort over truth, is another day we edge closer to repeating the darkest chapters of human history. Hit subscribe, share this video, and never let anyone tell you that some truths are too uncomfortable to face. Because the moment we stop learning from our worst moments is the moment we guarantee they'll happen again. Thanks for having the courage to watch this. Now have the courage to share it. We'll see you in the next episode, where we'll uncover another story they don't want you to know.